My name is Meredith Hale. I am 44 years old, and for 19 years I have worked as a fraud investigator for a regional credit union in Denver, Colorado. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early November, one of those crisp, bright Colorado days where the light comes in low and gold through the office windows, when a routine cross-institution flag crossed my dashboard at work. The same kind of automated alert I review a dozen times a week as part of my job, verifying unusual activity on accounts linked to partner institutions for fraud pattern monitoring. Most days, these flags are nothing. A snowbird's card used unexpectedly in Arizona, or a large but legitimate purchase that tripped an algorithm's threshold. I almost scrolled past this one the way I scroll past 40 others like it every week. Then I saw the property address listed against the disbursement. It was mine. A home equity line of credit, $38,000, was disbursed 3 days earlier against a property matching my own home address in Fort Collins, with two borrowers listed on the loan, Ryan Hale and Meredith Hale. My own name, on a loan secured by the house my children were sleeping in that very night, that I had never applied for, never discussed, and never signed. I sat at my desk for a long moment, staring at the screen, doing the thing 19 years of training has built into me almost involuntarily. Separating the fact from the feeling, cataloging what I was looking at with the same clinical distance I'd bring to any other case that crossed my desk. Except this case had my own name on it. This case was going to be waiting for me at my own kitchen table in 3 hours. I didn't call Ryan that afternoon. I didn't send an angry text or leave early to confront him. I sat in my car in the credit union's parking garage for nearly 20 minutes after my shift ended, engine off, running through what I already knew, professionally, about what a discovery like this usually meant, and what it was going to require of me to prove it the right way, the only way that had ever actually worked in 19 years of doing this job. What none of them understood yet, not Ryan, not his sister, not his mother, was that I had spent 14 years quietly keeping a private, exhaustive record of exactly this family's financial patterns, one entry at a time, precisely because some part of me had always suspected it might someday matter in exactly this way. That evening, I went home, helped my daughter with a science project, ate dinner across the table from a husband who had no idea what I already knew, and said absolutely nothing. What he didn't know yet was that the calmest person at that table was also, by then, already building the case that would end the version of our marriage he thought he was still safely inside. Welcome back if you've been here before, and if you're new, I'm glad you found this channel. I'm Meredith. I'm 44, and for nearly 2 decades I've made a career out of noticing the small inconsistencies other people miss in financial paperwork, which turned out to matter more in my own marriage than it ever did at work. If you've ever loved someone who always took someone else's side over yours, this story is for you. Stick with me to the end, because there's a question I want to ask you, and I really do want to hear your answer in the comments. Let me take you back to where this actually started, because you can't understand what happened in my kitchen that November without understanding what my marriage had already normalized for 14 years before it. I should tell you a little about where this pattern actually began, because it started decades before I ever entered the picture, and understanding its roots helped me, eventually, understand that I wasn't fighting Ryan so much as fighting a family habit 40 years in the making. Ryan and Courtney's father, Gary Hale, left the family when Ryan was 11 and Courtney was 7, after which Diane raised both children largely alone while working 2 jobs, a fact Ryan has told me more than once shaped nearly everything about how he sees his role in the family. Diane has told me, in her own words, that Courtney never really recovered from her father leaving the way Ryan did, and that she made a conscious decision in those early years to shield Courtney from as much additional hardship as possible while quietly expecting Ryan, 3 years older, to become something closer to a second parent than a sibling. By the time Ryan was 13, he was already the one walking Courtney home from school, the one covering for her when she skipped homework, the one absorbing consequences that, in a different household, might have simply landed on Courtney herself. I didn't understand any of this until nearly a decade into our marriage, and when I finally did, it explained a great deal, not as an excuse but as an origin. Ryan wasn't defending Courtney over me because he loved her more. He was defending her because, at 11 years old, defending her had become the single job he was given to prove he was worth keeping around, and nobody, in 30 years, had ever told him he was allowed to stop. I grew up in Fort Collins, Colorado, the older of two daughters, and I met my husband Ryan Hale in 2007 when we were both 25 at a mutual friend's barbecue. Ryan was warm, funny, and endlessly easy to be around, the kind of man who remembered everyone's birthday and never let a room stay quiet for long. We married in September of 2010, when I was 28 and he was 29, in a small ceremony outside Boulder that his mother helped plan almost entirely. Because Ryan's mother, Diane Hale, had very particular ideas about how things in her family were supposed to look, and Ryan had spent his whole life accommodating them without ever quite noticing he was doing it. Ryan has one sibling, a younger sister named Courtney Hale, 4 years his junior, who was 25 when I married her brother. Courtney was, from the very first family dinner I ever attended, the emotional center of gravity in that household, in a way I didn't fully understand until years later. She was bright and magnetic and chronically, spectacularly unstable in her decisions, 3 different college majors before she dropped out entirely. A string of jobs that never lasted past the 8-month mark, relationships that burnt hot and ended in dramatic, tearful phone calls to her mother, and increasingly after our wedding to Ryan. Diane Hale, their mother, had a phrase she used constantly, one I heard so many times over the years that I could recite it in my sleep. Courtney just feels things more than the rest of us. I want you to remember that phrase because it is, in miniature, the entire operating philosophy of the family I married into. The idea that Courtney's intensity was a kind of specialness that entitled her to different rules than everyone else, and that the rest of the family's job, unspoken but absolute, was to absorb the cost of that specialness without complaint. Here is a concrete memory from very early in our marriage that I think explains everything that followed. In March of 2011, 6 months after our wedding, Courtney called Ryan in tears at 11 at night because her car had been repossessed over 3 missed payments, and she needed a ride to work the next morning. Ryan left our apartment at that hour, drove 40 minutes to her place, and then, over the following 2 weeks, quietly used $2,200 of our joint savings we had been building specifically for a down payment on a house, to bring her car payments current and cover the repossession fees, without discussing it with me first. When I found out because I balanced our accounts every month and noticed the withdrawal, I asked him why he hadn't told me before doing it. He said, "Meredith, it was an emergency. I didn't have time to have a whole conversation about it." I remember how reasonable that sentence sounded in the moment, and how much less reasonable it looked in hindsight once I understood it wasn't really about time. It was about the fact that, in Ryan's mind, a conversation with me was an obstacle to clear, not a partnership to honor, whenever Courtney was involved. A second early memory, our first Thanksgiving as a married couple, November 2010, hosted at Diane's house in Fort Collins. I had spent the morning making a dish I was proud of, a family recipe from my own mother, and brought it, expecting some small acknowledgement the way any new daughter-in-law might. Courtney arrived 2 hours late, having, in her words, lost track of time, and the entire tenor of the afternoon shifted the moment she walked in, Diane fussing over whether she'd eaten, Ryan immediately pulling a chair out for her, and the conversation reorganizing itself around her lateness as though it were an event rather than a discourtesy. My dish went almost untouched. Nobody was unkind to me, exactly. I was simply quietly deprioritized in a room where I hadn't yet learnt that was going to be the permanent shape of things. I want to introduce something here that you'll need to remember for the rest of this story. In 2012, 2 years into our marriage, out of professional habit more than suspicion, I started keeping a private financial log. Not a joint document, not something Ryan knew about, just a personal spreadsheet on my own laptop where I tracked in a single running column every dollar that moved between our household finances and Courtney's life, whether as a loan, a gift, a co-signature, or an emergency transfer. I called it privately the ledger. I didn't start it because I suspected fraud. I started it because 26 years, no, at that point, 5 years into my career as a fraud investigator, I had simply developed the professional instinct to document patterns I couldn't yet name, and some quiet part of me had already begun to sense that this particular pattern was going to need documenting eventually. I want you to remember the ledger because it is the reason nothing that came later could survive contact with me once I finally decided to look at it as a whole. For the first several years, the amounts were small enough that I told myself they didn't matter. In 2010, just weeks before our wedding, Courtney asked Ryan to lend her $1,400 to cover a security deposit and first month's rent on a new apartment after a sudden breakup. Money that came directly out of the account we had specifically been building for our own honeymoon. When Ryan told me 3 days before the wedding itself that our honeymoon budget for Cabo had shrunk by nearly a third, he framed it as a small adjustment, something we'd make work. We ended up cutting our trip from 10 days to 7, and I remember standing in the airport on our actual honeymoon, genuinely happy, genuinely in love, while some small, quiet part of me filed away the fact that Courtney's housing crisis had already, before we were even legally married, taken precedence over something that was supposed to be entirely ours. In 2012, the year I started my private ledger, Courtney asked to borrow Ryan's car for what she described as just a few days, while her own was in the shop and kept it for 5 weeks, racking up 2 speeding tickets in the process that were mailed to our address since the car was still registered under Ryan's name. He paid both tickets, $310 combined, without asking her to reimburse him, and when I suggested gently that maybe he should, he told me, "It's not worth the fight, Meredith. She's stressed enough already." I remember that phrase specifically, "she's stressed enough already," because I would go on to hear some version of it, almost word for word, dozens of times over the following 13 years, deployed as the reason nearly every financial or emotional cost in this family eventually landed somewhere other than on Courtney herself. In 2013, $600 was given to cover Courtney's rent after she lost a retail job. In 2014, $1,100 went toward a broken transmission on the replacement car she'd bought after the repossession. Each time, Ryan framed it the same way: an emergency, a one-time thing, something he'd handle so I didn't have to worry about it. Each time, I let it go because $600 and $1,100 did not feel like hills worth dying on, and because Ryan, in every other way, was a genuinely loving, attentive husband. This wasn't a marriage defined by cruelty. It was defined by a specific, repeating blind spot, one I didn't yet have the full shape of. In 2015, our daughter Olivia was born, and for a while the family's attention actually did shift toward us in a way that felt, for the first time, balanced. Diane doted on her first grandchild. Courtney, to her credit, showed up more consistently that year than she had in the previous 4 combined. And in 2015, our daughter Olivia was born, and for a while, the family's attention actually did shift toward us in a way that felt, for the first time, balanced. Diane doted on her first grandchild, driving up twice a week just to hold her. Courtney, to her credit, showed up more consistently that year than she had in the previous 4 combined, bringing over a second-hand rocking chair she'd refinished herself and sitting with me for hours some afternoons while I nursed, telling me stories about their childhood that made me laugh, that made me, for the first time, feel something like real affection for her rather than just tolerance. I remember one evening in particular, Courtney holding 3-week-old Olivia on our back porch while Ryan grilled dinner, the 3 of us talking easily, with no crisis, no request, and no undercurrent of obligation, just an ordinary, good evening as a family. I want you to hold on to that evening, because it's proof that the warmth between us was never fabricated. It was real, and it was possible, and that's part of what made everything that came later so difficult to finally name for what it was. Because the people capable of that porch evening were the same people capable of everything that followed, and I never stopped loving the version of them I saw that night. I remember thinking naively that maybe becoming a mother had finally given me a permanent seat at the center of this family rather than its perpetual margin. That belief did not last as long as I wanted it to. In 2016, Courtney announced she was opening a small boutique clothing store in a strip mall outside Fort Collins, funded partly by a loan from Diane and partly, she told the family at a dinner that spring, by some help from Ryan. A phrase that turned out to mean $9,000 transferred from our home renovation fund, money we had specifically set aside to finally redo our outdated kitchen, without my knowledge, over the course of 6 weeks, in increments small enough that I didn't flag them in our joint account, until I did the maths retroactively that August. When I confronted Ryan about it, he told me, "Meredith, she's my sister. I couldn't just let her dream die over money that was just sitting there." I remember the specific sting of that sentence, money that was just sitting there, as though our kitchen renovation, something I had wanted for 3 years, was simply idle, undeserving capital compared to Courtney's ambitions. In 2017, the boutique predictably began struggling within its first year, and Courtney asked Ryan for an additional $4,500 to cover a shortfall in inventory costs before the holiday season. This time I was present for the conversation at our own kitchen table, and I said directly, "Ryan, we already gave $9,000 toward this business. I think it's fair to ask her to find another way to cover this." Courtney, sitting across from us, said in a tone that managed to sound wounded and reasonable at once, "I didn't realize helping family came with a spreadsheet now." Ryan didn't defend me. He looked down at the table and said quietly, "Let's just help her this once more, Mer. It's the last time." It was not the last time. That sentence, "it's the last time," became, over the following years, one of the most repeated and least true phrases in our marriage. In 2018, our son Caleb was born. The same year the boutique finally closed, having never turned a profit, leaving behind roughly $6,000 in unpaid inventory debt that Courtney could not cover, and which Ryan, again without a full conversation with me first, agreed to pay down himself over the following year using money withdrawn from an account we had opened specifically for our children's future education. I found out because I am, by profession and by habit, the kind of person who checks the statements, and when I brought it to Ryan, exhausted, 4 months postpartum with a newborn and a 3-year-old, he said something that has stayed with me for years since. "You always find this stuff. Do you ever just trust me?" I remember sitting with that question a long time because it inverted the entire situation so completely. As though my professional competence, the very thing that let me protect our family's finances, were itself the betrayal, rather than the thing it kept uncovering. I want to add one more detail from that same year because it's small, but it stayed with me. A few weeks after that conversation, I asked Ryan whether he'd be willing to set up automatic contribution alerts on the education account so that both of us would get notified anytime money moved in or out, regardless of the reason. He agreed easily, almost eagerly, telling me it was a really good idea, honestly. He never actually set it up. I found this out 18 months later in early 2020 when I finally checked the account settings myself after another unexplained withdrawal, this one of $850, again from Courtney. Again, something I only discovered after the fact. When I asked him about the alerts he'd promised to set up, he said simply, "I meant to. I just kept forgetting." I don't think that was a lie exactly. I think it was something more troubling than a lie, a genuine, unforced forgetting, the kind that happens only when a task doesn't actually feel important to the person forgetting it, no matter how many times he tells you otherwise. I want to pause here and tell you something warmer, because this marriage and this family were not made only of these moments, and it would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. Ryan was, in nearly every other dimension, a genuinely present father and a kind husband. He coached Caleb's youth soccer team for 3 years without missing a single Saturday. He drove 90 minutes each way twice to sit with my own father during a hospitalization in 2019 without being asked, simply because he knew I needed someone there and couldn't be in 2 places at once. I share this because I think it matters. The pattern I'm describing to you wasn't the entire man. It was a specific, repeating failure of judgment around exactly one relationship in his life. And understanding that distinction is, I think, part of what made this so difficult to finally confront, because the rest of him was worth fighting to keep. Earlier that same year, in February of 2019, Courtney had asked Ryan to be a guarantor on an apartment lease she couldn't qualify for on her own credit. A 1-year commitment that made Ryan financially responsible for her rent if she defaulted. She defaulted twice that year, missing payments in July and October, both times covered quietly by Ryan from our joint checking account. A combined $2,400 I only discovered when reconciling our year-end statements that December. When I asked him why he hadn't mentioned either missed payment as it happened, he told me, "I didn't want you worrying about something I already had handled." I remember telling him that handled and hidden from me were not the same word, even though he seemed to use them interchangeably whenever Courtney was involved. In 2019, Courtney, between jobs again after the marketing firm let her go during a round of layoffs, asked to move into our finished basement for just a few months while she saved for her own apartment after a breakup. Those few months became 14. During that time, she contributed nothing toward utilities despite repeated, gentle requests from me, and on 2 occasions used my own emergency credit card, which Ryan had without telling me, given her the number 2 in case something happened while you're at work. for a combined $340 in charges at restaurants and a hair salon that had nothing to do with emergencies. When I raised this with Ryan, he said, "She's going through a hard time, Meredith. Can we not make this a whole thing?" I did not make it a whole thing. I paid it down quietly, the way I had learnt to do with almost everything by then, and added the entry to my ledger. In 2020, during the early months of the pandemic, when Ryan was placed on reduced hours and our own household income dropped by nearly a third, Courtney asked Ryan for $2,800 to cover 3 months of her own rent after losing her job at a marketing firm. Ryan agreed from what remained of our joint savings. The same week he told me we needed to tighten our belts on our own household spending, cutting Olivia's swim lessons and delaying a needed repair on our car because money was tight. I remember standing in our garage, looking at the car we couldn't yet afford to fix, doing the math in my head, and understanding with a kind of cold clarity that the belt Ryan meant was never going to include Courtney, no matter how tight things became for the rest of us. In 2021, the pattern took a turn that, looking back, I recognize as the moment the stakes stopped being merely financial and became something closer to structural. Diane, then 71, began drafting an updated estate plan with a local attorney, intending to split her modest assets, primarily her paid-off house, worth roughly $310,000, evenly between Ryan and Courtney. Courtney, over a series of family dinners that spring, began gently, persistently suggesting that because she didn't have Ryan's financial stability, it might make more sense for her to receive a larger share, or for the house itself to go to her outright, with Ryan receiving other assets instead. I remember one dinner in April specifically, where Courtney said almost lightly, passing a dish across the table as she said it, "It's not like Ryan needs the house, Mom. He's got Meredith's income too. I've got nobody." Nobody at the table challenged that framing, including Ryan, even though it quietly erased my own income, my own career, and the equity we'd built together in our own home, as though none of it counted toward Ryan's stability at all, simply because it happened to also belong to me. Ryan did not push back on this suggestion even once in my presence across 4 separate dinners where the topic came up. When I asked him privately why he never said anything, he told me, "It's not really my place to argue with my mom about her own house, Meredith." I pointed out that it was, in fact, entirely his place, since it was his inheritance being discussed and redirected in front of him. He didn't have an answer for that. I remember asking him a follow-up question that night, one I don't think he expected. If this were reversed, if it were my mother's house and my sister were asking for the bigger share, would you expect me to just sit there quietly too? He was quiet for a long moment before admitting, "No, I don't think I would." I asked him what the difference was. He didn't have an answer for that either. I want to tell you about someone else in this story now, because you'll need to remember her too. My mother-in-law's older sister, my husband's aunt, a woman named Patricia Voss, had known both Ryan and Courtney since infancy, and had watched this family's dynamics unfold for 4 decades with a clearer eye than almost anyone inside the immediate household. At a small gathering in the summer of 2021, Patricia pulled me aside on Diane's back porch, watching Ryan and Courtney through the kitchen window as they laughed together over something, and said something I've carried with me every day since. "Meredith, you keep score because you're the only one in this family who's ever been willing to add it all up. Someday, somebody in this family is going to need that math, whether they want to hear it or not." I laughed it off at the time, the way you do with a compliment that feels a little too accurate to sit comfortably with. I asked her, half joking, what she thought would happen when that day came. She looked at me for a long moment, entirely serious, and said, "I think you'll be the calmest person in the room. You always are." I didn't understand yet how literally both of those sentences were going to matter. In 2022, an incident happened that I think crystallized, more than any dollar figure could, exactly what this pattern was costing our own children, not just our finances. Olivia, then 7, had been invited to a week-long summer gymnastics camp she'd been talking about for months, a genuine passion of hers, costing $650 for the session. I had already paid the deposit in April. In June, 3 weeks before the camp began, Ryan told me, almost in passing while making dinner, that he'd used $650 from our joint checking account to help Courtney cover a car repair, just until her next paycheck, and that we might need to hold off on the remainder of Olivia's camp balance until the following month. I remember standing in our kitchen, actually speechless for a moment, something that almost never happens to me, because for the first time, the trade-off wasn't abstract or between 2 adults managing their own inconveniences. It was between our daughter's actual excitement about something she loved and Courtney's car. I paid the remaining balance myself, from my own personal savings account, the following morning without telling Ryan I'd done it, because I genuinely did not trust myself to have that conversation calmly at that moment. Olivia went to camp. She had by every account one of the best weeks of her childhood so far, coming home able to do a cartwheel she'd been practicing in our backyard for a year. Ryan never noticed the payment had gone through under my own account rather than our joint one. I let that go too at the time, but I want to be honest that this was the incident that finally, quietly, convinced me the pattern was no longer something I could simply keep absorbing indefinitely. Somewhere between watching Olivia do that cartwheel in our backyard and realizing her own father hadn't even noticed how close her summer had come to being sacrificed for his sister's car, I understood that the cost of this family's habits had stopped being just mine to carry. A recurring, expected feature of our finances that I had, in my quieter moments, simply started budgeting around the way you budget around a subscription you've stopped questioning. That spring, she asked Ryan to co-sign an $18,000 personal loan to help her open a second business venture, this time a mobile pet grooming service, arguing that with her own credit still damaged from the boutique's collapse, she needed a co-signer to get approved at all. Ryan agreed again without a full conversation with me. He told me about it 2 weeks after the loan had already closed, framing it, as always, as something already decided, something I was being informed of rather than consulted on. I remember asking him plainly, "Ryan, do you understand that co-signing means we are legally responsible for this debt if she doesn't pay it?" He said, "She's not going to not pay it, Meredith. Have a little faith in her." I did not have faith in her, not because I wished her ill, but because I had, by then, 11 years of documented evidence suggesting faith was not the operative variable in how these situations tended to resolve. Around the midpoint of this story, I want to pause and ask you something, because I think a lot of you watching have lived some version of what I'm describing. Have you ever loved someone who consistently chose someone else's comfort over your own, not out of malice, but out of a lifetime of habit so old neither of you had ever really examined it? If that's true for you, comment with the word overlooked below, because I want to know how many of us are carrying a version of this same story. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the moment, because what happened next is the reason I'm telling you any of this at all. In 2023, the pet grooming business, like the boutique before it, began to falter within its first year. By September, Courtney had missed 2 consecutive loan payments, and the lender began contacting Ryan directly as the co-signer about the delinquency. Ryan brought the first missed payment current himself, $410, without telling me until the credit union, not mine, thankfully, but a different institution, sent a follow-up notice to our home address. I found the notice in the mail before he did. I remember standing in our entryway reading it, feeling something shift in me that was quieter than anger, closer to a kind of tired, clear-eyed recognition. This was never going to stop on its own. That same fall, my own mother, Carol, then 68, had a minor stroke, her second in 3 years, and spent 5 days in the hospital. Ryan visited once for about 40 minutes, apologizing that he had a lot going on with Courtney's loan situation and couldn't be there more. I sat with my mother alone for 4 of those 5 nights, the way I had learnt over 13 years of marriage to sit alone with the things that mattered most to me, while Ryan's attention orbited, almost gravitationally, toward whichever crisis of Courtney's happened to be loudest that week. I remember one of those nights specifically around 10 o'clock, my mother half asleep in her hospital bed, murmuring, "Is Ryan coming tomorrow?" I told her he'd try, the same soft, protective lie I imagine my own father-in-law's family had been telling each other about Ryan and Courtney for decades. She nodded and drifted back to sleep, and I sat there a while longer in the plastic chair, feeling the specific, familiar loneliness of being the one who shows up while loving someone who, in that exact moment, wasn't. I didn't say anything to Ryan about it directly at the time. I wrote it in the ledger instead, the way I had learnt to do with almost everything by then, one more entry in a column that was getting harder and harder to ignore. I remember, that same week, calculating, almost involuntarily, the total number of hospital or emergency-adjacent hours I had spent alone over our marriage compared to the number Ryan had spent alone for Courtney's crises. A comparison I hadn't consciously set out to make, but that arrived anyway, unbidden, the way professional habits sometimes surface exactly where you least want them to. The numbers were not close. I didn't write that particular comparison down. Some entries I decided didn't need to exist anywhere except in my own memory, at least for now. I think back often to a specific moment from years earlier that captures this pattern especially clearly, even now, looking back from where I stand today. In 2017, my cousin's wedding took place in Aspen, and Ryan and I had budgeted carefully for the trip since it required flights, a hotel, and time off work we'd both had to request months in advance. 2 weeks before the wedding, Courtney called Ryan in a panic because she'd been let go unexpectedly from her latest job and couldn't afford the bridesmaid dress and travel costs for a separate wedding she'd committed to attend for a college friend the same weekend. Ryan, without asking me, transferred $900 from the account we'd been using to cover our own Aspen trip expenses, which meant that by the time we arrived, we had to share a single rental car with another couple to save money and skip one of the pre-wedding events entirely because we couldn't cover the cost of the private dinner. I remember standing in our hotel room that weekend, looking at Ryan getting ready, and saying quietly, "Do you understand that we skipped an event at my own family's wedding so your sister could go to someone else's?" He said, "I didn't think about it that way." I told him that was, in fact, exactly the problem. He never had to think about it that way because the cost of not thinking about it always, somehow, landed on me to absorb instead of him. I want to name something directly here because I think it's worth saying plainly rather than just describing it through examples. That's the machinery of it, if you want to call it what it actually is. In a family like the one I married into, urgency gets treated as a moral trump card. It doesn't matter whose plans were made first, whose money was saved longest, or whose need was actually greater in the wider scope of things. Whoever manufactures the loudest, most immediate crisis gets first claim on the family's resources every single time, and the people whose needs arrive quietly, on schedule, without drama, simply learn, year after year, that quiet needs are the ones that get deprioritized. I didn't understand, for a long time, that I was training my own family to treat me that way simply by never once matching Courtney's volume with my own. Rather than the even split originally intended, the house went to Courtney outright, with Ryan receiving a smaller cash inheritance intended, on paper, to balance things fairly, according to the attorney's language, though the actual dollar values were not remotely equivalent. The house alone was worth more than 3 times the cash Ryan was slated to receive. Ryan told me about the final version of the plan almost apologetically, as though it were whether rather than a decision, something that had simply happened to him rather than something he had spent 3 years declining to contest. When I asked whether he'd ever told his mother plainly that he thought this was unfair, he said, "What would be the point, Meredith? It would just cause a fight and I'd probably lose anyway." I remember thinking in that moment that he had spent his entire life so thoroughly trained not to contest anything involving Courtney that he no longer even recognized unfairness as something worth naming out loud, let alone fighting for. There is a particular kind of loneliness in loving someone who will defend a sibling's smallest inconvenience with more energy than he'll defend your shared life's biggest injustices. And I want to be honest that by the middle of 2024, I had started to feel that loneliness constantly, even in rooms where Ryan and I were, by every outward measure, still a happy couple. We still laughed together. We still took the kids camping every August, the way we had for a decade. But underneath all of that, a specific and steadily widening gap had opened between what I needed from my marriage and what my marriage was actually built to give me, and I had started quietly to wonder how long a person could live inside that gap before something inside her simply gave out. I want to tell you about the year before all of this came apart, because it would be dishonest to suggest our marriage had been in steady decline the whole time. In fact, 2024 and much of 2025 and 26 were, by most measures, some of the best years Ryan and I had had together in a long time. After the estate plan conversation, something in Ryan seemed to soften in ways I hadn't seen before. He started coming to my mother's follow-up appointments after her stroke without being asked. He initiated, for the first time in our marriage, a real conversation about setting boundaries with Courtney, telling me one night in February of 2024, unprompted, "I've been thinking about what you said about the estate thing. I think I've let a lot of stuff slide over the years that I shouldn't have." I remember how much that sentence meant to me, how badly I wanted to believe it was the beginning of something lasting rather than a temporary correction. For nearly 18 months, it genuinely seemed to be both. Courtney, between business ventures, took an actual full-time job at a marketing agency in Denver, and for the first time in over a decade, went nearly a full year without asking Ryan or Diane for money. We had a wonderful family trip to the Oregon coast that summer, just the four of us. The first vacation in years that hadn't been shadowed by some looming financial obligation to someone else. Ryan and I renewed, informally, a kind of closeness I genuinely started to think we'd lost for good late-night conversations, real listening, and the specific ease of two people who trust each other completely. I remember telling my sister Jenna that August over the phone that I finally felt like Ryan and I were building a marriage that was actually just ours, rather than one perpetually subsidizing someone else's. I believed that completely when I said it. I want you to understand that I believed it, because it makes what came next land the way it actually landed on me, not as confirmation of something I'd always suspected, but as a betrayal of something I had cautiously, finally allowed myself to trust again. That's why the HELOC, when I found it that November, didn't just feel like one more entry in a long pattern. It felt like a door I had watched slowly, carefully reopen over 18 months, slamming shut all at once, except this time it wasn't Courtney standing on the other side of it asking for something. It was my own husband, quietly signing my name to a document while telling me in every other room of our life that things between us had finally changed for good. Courtney had spent most of 2025 developing what she described, with real enthusiasm, as her most serious business idea yet. A boutique wellness studio combining yoga instruction with a small retail shopfront, an idea she'd researched more thoroughly than either of her previous ventures, and pitched at a family dinner that August with genuine passion. I want to be fair here, it was not on its face a foolish idea. Fort Collins had a growing market for exactly that kind of studio, and Courtney had, for the first time in years, put together an actual business plan, complete with projected costs and a realistic timeline. What she did not have was $65,000 in startup capital, and what Ryan did not tell me. Across 3 months of conversations, I now understand what was happening entirely without me. He had agreed to help her get it by opening a home equity line of credit against our own house. The house Olivia and Caleb were growing up in, using both our names, my signature included, on a document I had never seen, never signed, and never consented to. I found out the way I find out almost everything in my professional life, through a routine flag in a system, except this time the system was my own household, and the flag was my own name. You already know the shape of that afternoon, the dashboard, the address, and the two names where there should have only been reason for one. What I haven't told you yet is what those first hours actually looked like once I was home, sitting across from the man who'd put my name there without asking. I want to walk you through what I did in the days immediately after, because it wasn't confrontation yet. It was verification, the unglamorous, necessary work that comes before anyone gets to say anything out loud. I requested my own credit report the following morning, on my lunch break, using nothing but my legal right as an account holder, and confirmed the HELOC was reporting exactly as the dashboard flag had shown it. 2 names, 1 signature I didn't recognize as my own. I pulled 6 documents from our home filing cabinet that carried my genuine signature: a mortgage refinance, a car loan, a notarized power of attorney, my passport renewal, my employment contract, and 3 years of joint tax returns, and laid them quietly in a drawer of my home office desk where Ryan wouldn't casually come across them. I did not confront Ryan that day. What none of them understood yet, not Ryan, not Courtney, not Diane, was that I had spent 14 years quietly keeping a private, exhaustive record of exactly this family's financial patterns, one entry at a time, precisely because some part of me had always suspected it might, someday, matter in exactly this way. And a signature I had never given was about to become the loudest thing in my professional and personal life at once. I want to tell you what those first hours actually felt like, because it wasn't rage, not at first. It was a very specific, very clinical stillness. The same stillness I bring to any fraud case at work. The mental posture of separating the fact of what happened from the feeling of what it meant, because feelings, in my experience, make you sloppy, and I could not afford to be sloppy about something with my own name on it. I sat at my desk for nearly 40 minutes after that flag appeared, not moving, running through the actual legal mechanics of what I was looking at. Either my signature had been forged outright or Ryan had signed my name himself, believing, perhaps, that he had implicit authorization simply because we were married. A belief that is legally false and one I, of all people, knew exactly how to prove was false. That evening, I did not say anything at dinner. I watched Ryan help Caleb with his math homework, watched Olivia describe a science project with the specific breathless enthusiasm of a 10-year-old, and felt the strange, vertiginous sensation of sitting inside a completely ordinary family evening, while carrying, silently, the knowledge that something fundamental about my marriage had just been proven true in a way I could no longer explain away as habit or oversight. After the kids were in bed, I went to my laptop and pulled up my own private ledger for the first time in months and began methodically adding a new final entry. The HELOC, the date, the amount, and beside it in a column I'd never had to use before, a single word: forged or possibly forged pending verification. Over the following 10 days, before I said a single word to Ryan about what I'd found, I did what 14 years of training had built me to do without even having to decide to do it. I built the record. I requested through entirely legitimate means available to me as an account holder, the original HELOC application and closing documents from the lender, a regional bank I did not personally work for, avoiding any conflict of interest in how I obtained them. I compared the signature on the closing documents against 6 other documents that indisputably carried my genuine signature: our mortgage refinance from 2019, my passport renewal from 2022, a car loan from 2023, my employment contract, a notarized power of attorney I'd signed for my mother during her hospitalization, and our joint tax returns going back 3 years. My signature, unlike some people's, doesn't have a single dramatic flourish. It is something more useful for exactly this purpose: a very specific, consistent slant and a particular way I connect the M and the E that I have done identically since college, a habit so mechanical I don't even think about it anymore. The signature on the HELOC documents did not have that connection. It was close. It was close enough that a loan officer glancing quickly at a stack of paperwork on a busy Tuesday would never have caught it. It was not close enough to survive comparison against 6 genuine exemplars laid out side by side under a desk lamp, the way I laid them out on our dining room table one night after Ryan had gone to bed, the same table where we'd eaten 1,000 ordinary dinners as a family. I also want to address something directly, because I think it matters for understanding how carefully I had to move during those first weeks. As a fraud investigator, I take professional ethics extremely seriously. The dashboard flag that first alerted me to the HELOC was something I encountered entirely within the normal authorized scope of my job, reviewing cross-institution activity as part of routine partner verification work, not something I went looking for using access I wasn't entitled to. Once I recognized my own name and address on that flag, I immediately recused myself from any further professional handling of the case file, exactly as our internal compliance policy requires when an investigator has a personal connection to a flagged account, and formally logged that recusal with my supervisor the same afternoon, citing only a personal financial matter requiring reassignment, without detailing the specifics. Everything I did after that point, requesting my own credit report, obtaining the closing documents, and commissioning the handwriting analysis, I did strictly as a private citizen and account holder, using only the rights any borrower has, never touching my professional access again in connection with my own case. I want to be transparent about that distinction because it mattered enormously to me personally, and because part of what let me stay calm through all of this was knowing that even the way I discovered the truth was something I could stand behind completely, without a single shortcut I'd have to explain away later. There was one more piece of evidence I found during those 2 weeks of quiet verification, and I want to tell you about it separately, because it changed the way I understood everything that had happened. Ryan had, several years earlier, set up a shared family cloud backup for our phones, mostly for photos of the kids, a system I still had access to even though neither of us checked it often. Late one night, unable to sleep, I found myself scrolling through an old backup of message threads that had synced automatically months earlier, before Ryan had switched to a different messaging app for most of his day-to-day conversations. Buried in that backup was a thread between Ryan and Courtney from August of 2025, 3 months before the HELOC closed. I want to be careful here because I don't say this to paint Courtney as some calculating villain out of a movie. I don't believe that's really who she is even now. But the thread showed something I hadn't let myself fully consider. This wasn't simply Ryan making a unilateral, impulsive decision to protect his sister. Courtney had asked him directly in writing, "Do you think Meredith's going to be an issue about this?" And Ryan had answered, "I'll handle it. Easier if we don't make it a whole conversation before it's already moving." I read that exchange 3 times before I could fully absorb what it meant, that the choice to exclude me hadn't been an accident of poor communication, the way Ryan would later frame it at Diane's table. It had been a plan, discussed and agreed to in advance, specifically designed around the assumption that if I knew in time, I would say no, and that the correct response to that assumption was not to change the plan, but to make sure I never got the chance to weigh in until it was already too late to matter. I printed that thread and added it to the portfolio, alongside the signature comparisons, though I made a deliberate choice not to lead with it at the confrontation itself. I wanted the signatures to stand entirely on their own first because the forgery was the part that was legally, unambiguously wrong regardless of intent. The thread I saved for later in that same conversation, once Ryan had already admitted to signing my name himself, because I wanted him to understand that I wasn't only angry about the forgery as an isolated lapse in judgment. I was responding to a decision that had been discussed, planned, and executed with my exclusion built into it from the very beginning. I called my closest friend from college, Angela Cho, who now works as a family law attorney in Denver, not yet as my lawyer, just as my friend, and told her everything over coffee on a Saturday morning while Ryan took the kids to a soccer game. Angela listened without interrupting, the way good friends and good lawyers both learn to do, and when I finished, she asked me the question that mattered most. Meredith, before we talk about what this means legally, I need to know, what do you actually want to happen here? Do you want your marriage to survive this? I didn't have a clean answer for her that day. Some part of me still loved Ryan deeply, still believed in the version of him that drove 90 minutes to sit with my father in a hospital room, still wanted, badly, for this to turn out to be some solvable, forgivable mistake rather than the culmination of 14 years of a pattern I now had to call, honestly, by its real name. I also spoke with a therapist I'd started seeing that same month, Dr. Naomi Fairweather, who specializes in couples and family systems, initially framing my visits to her, even to myself, as being about some stress at home. Within our second session, the real subject had become unavoidable. She asked me a question I've returned to many times since. Meredith, when you imagine confronting this directly, what specifically are you afraid of losing, Ryan, or the version of yourself that's always been the one who holds everything together without complaint? I sat with that question for the better part of a week before I could admit, honestly, that some portion of my hesitation wasn't really about protecting my marriage at all. It was about the fact that being the reliable one, the one who quietly absorbed and managed and never made a scene, had become so central to my own identity over 14 years that I genuinely didn't know who I would be on the other side of finally, publicly, refusing to absorb one more thing. Dr. Fairweather asked me something else in our third session that I think matters just as much. She asked me to describe, specifically, what I imagine would happen to Ryan if I stopped protecting him from the consequences of his own choices, not what would happen to our marriage, but to him, individually, as a person. I remember struggling to answer that because I realized, sitting in her office, that I had spent 14 years unconsciously treating Ryan's comfort as something fragile that required my constant, careful management, the same way his entire family had always treated Courtney's feelings as something that couldn't survive honest friction. Dr. Fairweather pointed out gently that this instinct, protecting someone from the natural results of their own decisions, was itself a version of exactly the pattern I was trying to hold Ryan accountable for. I didn't love hearing that. I've thought about it almost every day since because it was true. There was one particular night, about 10 days after I first found the flagged HELOC, that I think captures the emotional center of this decision better than anything else I could describe. I was sitting in my parked car in our own driveway, engine off, unable to make myself go inside and sit through a normal family dinner as though nothing had changed. I called my younger sister, Jenna, and for nearly half an hour, instead of asking her opinion, I just talked, uninterrupted, about every fear circling in my head that Ryan would somehow make this about my always keeping score, the way Courtney once had. That Diane would side with her children the way she always had. That some part of me, after 14 years of being the fixer, the documenter, the one who quietly cleaned up whatever mess Courtney's latest crisis left behind, didn't actually know how to exist in this marriage without that role. When I finally stopped talking, Jenna was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I didn't expect. I think you're scared that if you stop being useful to them, you'll find out you were never actually as loved as you were needed. But you don't know that's true, you've just never tested it. She was right. In 14 years, I never had. I also talked to a coworker I trust completely, Priya Malhotra, a senior investigator on my team with almost as many years in fraud work as I have. Someone I'd normally never bring anything this personal to, given how much our job runs on professional discretion. I made an exception with Priya because she has handled more spousal financial abuse and coercive debt cases than almost anyone I know, far more than my narrower specialty typically touches. I described the situation to her in general terms over lunch without full names and asked her a direct, practical question. In her experience, how do these situations usually resolve once the spouse who was forged against actually comes forward? She told me honestly that in her experience, the marriages that survived something like this were almost always the ones where the offending spouse stopped defending the relative involved and started, instead, defending the marriage itself. And that the ones that didn't survive were, almost without exception, the ones where the pattern simply repeated once the immediate crisis passed. I asked her if it was worth it to come forward anyway, regardless of which way it went. She said, "Meredith, that's not really the question you should be asking. The question is whether you can keep living inside a marriage where you're the only one who ever has to prove anything happened. Everything else is just the shape the consequences take." I did not go to Ryan first with what I'd found. I went instead to Angela's office formally this time and asked her to help me understand my actual legal options, separate from whatever happened with my marriage emotionally. She explained, plainly, that forging a spouse's signature on a loan document is not a gray area. It's a form of financial fraud, regardless of the relationship between the parties, and that I had clear legal standing to have the loan voided as to my own liability and potentially to pursue further action depending on what I ultimately wanted. She walked me through the specific mechanics in more detail than I'd expected, sitting across her desk with a legal pad between us. First, she explained, we would need to file a formal fraud dispute directly with the lender's fraud investigation unit, supported by documentary evidence, comparative signatures, and independent handwriting analysis, and ideally a notarized statement from me confirming I had never applied for or authorized the loan. Second, she explained that Colorado law would allow us to pursue this either purely as a civil dispute against the lender to remove my liability, or, separately, as a matter between Ryan and me, if I chose to treat the forgery as a factor in any future marital or financial proceedings. A distinction she was careful to note I did not need to decide immediately. Third, she raised, gently, the question of whether I wanted to involve law enforcement at all, since forgery of this kind can, technically, rise to a criminal matter in Colorado, though she noted that prosecutors rarely pursue charges in cases involving spouses absent aggravating circumstances, and that most resolutions of this type happen entirely within the civil and lender dispute process. I asked her honestly whether pursuing this the right way, through documentation and process rather than through a screaming confrontation, meant I was somehow being too calm about something that deserved rage. She said, "Meredith, calm is not the absence of feeling this. Calm is what lets you actually win it." She also told me something else that stayed with me through the following weeks. The people who come into my office already this organized almost never lose. Not because the law favors them specially, but because organization is what makes the truth undeniable. And undeniable truth is the only thing that actually ends these situations cleanly. I asked her, near the end of that first formal meeting, how long a case like mine typically took to resolve once the paperwork was this clean. She estimated 6 to 10 weeks for the lender dispute alone, assuming no unusual resistance from the institution, though she was careful to add that the marriage itself, unlike the loan, didn't come with a predictable timeline at all. By late November, I had a folder, not the metaphorical ledger anymore, but an actual physical binder, the private spreadsheet having long since outgrown a single tab, containing the forged HELOC documents, the 6 comparative signature exemplars, a written analysis I'd prepared myself using the same methodology I use professionally, and at Angela's recommendation, a preliminary letter from a certified handwriting examiner confirming what I already knew. I had still not said one word to Ryan. Every ordinary evening during those weeks, helping Caleb with his times tables, watching Olivia's swim meet, folding laundry together the way we had for 15 years, I carried this silently, and I want to be honest that the silence itself more than the forgery was the part that hurt the most, because it meant living, for weeks, inside a version of my marriage that no longer matched what I now knew to be true. I chose to confront it, finally, not privately in our kitchen, the way I might have years earlier when the amounts were smaller, and my patience for absorbing consequences was larger, but at Diane's house, during a family dinner already scheduled for the second Sunday of December, ostensibly to discuss holiday plans. I told Ryan only that I wanted to talk about some paperwork, while everyone was together, true, if deliberately incomplete. I wanted Courtney and Diane present, not to humiliate anyone, but because I had spent 14 years watching this family's dynamics play out with me as the only person who ever had the full picture, and I was done being the only one who understood the actual shape of what was happening. We sat around Diane's dining room table, the same table where I'd eaten that first cold Thanksgiving 15 years earlier. Diane had made her usual pot roast, the smell of it filling the house the way it had at 100 other ordinary family dinners. Courtney arrived on time for once, cheerful, talking about a new supplier she'd found for the Wellness Studio's retail inventory, having no idea what was sitting in the leather portfolio I'd placed beside my chair. I remember watching her laugh at something Caleb said, easy and warm, and feeling a strange, tired absence of triumph in what I was about to do. This wasn't a moment I had waited years to enjoy. It was simply a moment that had finally, unavoidably, arrived. After dinner, once the kids had gone to watch a movie in the living room, I said plainly, "Ryan, I need to talk about the HELOC." His face changed immediately, not confusion, I noticed, but something closer to recognition, the specific look of a person realizing a conversation he'd been quietly dreading had finally caught up with him. I opened the portfolio and set the first document on the table. The closing disclosure, my name printed clearly beside his. This loan was opened against our house in September for $38,000. I never applied for it. I never saw these documents until 3 weeks ago. I placed the second document beside it, one of my genuine signature exemplars, the mortgage refinance from 2019. This is my actual signature. I placed the HELOC signature page directly beside it. And this is what's on the loan. I want you to look at both of these closely and tell me honestly whether you think they're the same. Ryan looked at the two signatures for a long moment, and something in his shoulders dropped visibly, the posture of a person who has just watched an explanation he'd been building for weeks collapse before he could even offer it. Courtney, beside him, had gone very still. Ryan tried first, the explanation I think he'd genuinely rehearsed for exactly this moment. "Meredith, I wasn't trying to hide anything from you forever. I knew you'd say no if I asked, and I really believed in what Courtney was building this time, more than either of the other times, and I thought I could get it approved and pay it down before it ever became a real issue for you. I was going to tell you once I knew it was working." I said calmly, "Ryan, you didn't get a loan approved without telling me. You signed my name on legal documents without my knowledge or consent. That's not a communication problem you were planning to fix later. That's forgery, and I know that not because I'm angry, but because it's literally what I do for a living." He tried a second angle, quieter, almost pleading. "I would never have let it actually hurt you. I would have paid it off myself if it came to that." I told him, "Ryan, it already hurt me. It hurt me the moment my name went on a legal document I never saw. Whether or not you intended to protect me from the consequences doesn't undo the fact that you decided alone that my consent wasn't something you needed to ask for." Courtney tried a different angle entirely, the one I'd watched her use for years whenever a family conversation turned uncomfortable, reframing the discomfort itself as the real offense. "I can't believe we're doing this at Mom's dinner table in front of the kids' movie night over paperwork," she said. "This is exactly what I mean, Meredith. Everything with you always has to become a whole thing." I let that sit in the room for a moment before I answered, because I wanted Diane and Ryan both to hear it clearly. "Courtney, I didn't choose for this to become a whole thing. Someone forged my signature on a legal document securing our home. I'm simply the person telling you that happened calmly with proof instead of pretending it didn't." She didn't have a response to that. She tried once more, quieter and aimed at her mother rather than at me. "I never asked him to put her name on anything. That was his decision, not mine." It was technically true, and also I pointed out gently, entirely beside the point. The money had still been meant for her and requested by her, and she had never once, across 3 months of conversations, asked how it was being financed or whether both her brother and his wife had actually agreed to it. Diane, who had been quiet through most of the exchange, finally spoke, and I want to tell you honestly that what she said surprised me. She looked at the two signatures on the table for a long moment, put on her reading glasses, and then looked at her son with an expression I had genuinely never seen her wear in 15 years of family dinners. Not defensiveness, but something closer to exhaustion. the specific tiredness of a person finally doing arithmetic she'd spent decades avoiding. "Ryan," she said quietly, "did you actually write your wife's name on that loan yourself?" Ryan didn't answer right away. When he finally did, it was barely above a whisper. "I thought I was protecting the family. I thought if it worked out, none of this would even matter." I want to describe what happened next because it's the moment I think finally broke through whatever remaining explanation Ryan and Courtney had left. I reached back into the portfolio and set down one final page, the printed message thread from August. I didn't read it aloud dramatically. I simply slid it across the table and said, "Ryan, I want you to explain this one to your mother, since you're telling us this was about protecting the family and not about protecting yourselves from having to ask me first." He read the 2 lines silently. I watched the color actually leave his face. Courtney reached for the page to read it, and for the first time all evening said nothing at all, no reframe, no accusation that I was making a whole thing out of nothing. Diane read it last, set it down slowly, and looked at both of her children with an expression that told me, more than anything else that night, that something in this family's oldest, most unexamined habit had just been named out loud, in writing, in a way none of them would be able to quietly explain away later. And there it is, the line I want you to remember, the moment the entire shape of this story changed, because Ryan didn't deny what he'd done. He simply explained it as protection, the same word I would learn later his own mother had used about Courtney for 30 years without ever once examining what it actually protected and from whom. I told him plainly, the one thing I had rehearsed with Angela, the sentence I knew would land the whole weight of this conversation without me ever having to raise my voice. "Ryan, you have spent 15 years defending your sister against every version of me that ever asked for fairness. Tonight, for the first time, I need you to understand that fairness isn't the enemy of family. It's the only thing that was ever going to keep one." He didn't have an answer for that either. Nobody at that table did. I did not scream. I did not throw anything or storm out. I closed the portfolio quietly and told Ryan that I had already filed a fraud dispute with the lender the week before, using the documentation in front of him, and that regardless of what happened between us as a couple, the loan itself was already procedurally in the process of being reversed as to my liability. That part, I told him, wasn't a negotiation. That part was simply already true. The aftermath has not been tidy, and I won't pretend to you that it has. The lender's fraud department, once presented with the comparative signature analysis and the handwriting examiner's letter, moved relatively quickly. Within 6 weeks, by mid-January of 2026, my name was formally removed from the loan. And the full liability was restructured under Ryan's name alone, a resolution that required him to refinance a portion of the debt independently, at a higher personal cost, but one he did not contest, having, I think, finally run out of the energy required to keep pretending this was a small thing. I want to walk you through those 6 weeks a little more slowly, because they were harder than the resolution itself makes them sound. The week after the dinner at Diane's, Ryan moved into our guest room, not because I asked him to, but because he told me he needed space to actually sit with what he'd done instead of trying to talk his way past it. And I remember being surprised by that, because it was the first time in 15 years I'd watched him choose discomfort over avoidance without me having to push him into it. We didn't speak much that first week, beyond logistics about the kids. I remember lying awake more than one of those nights, genuinely unsure whether I was watching the beginning of the end of my marriage or the beginning of something harder and more honest than what we'd had before. Angela handled the formal fraud dispute with the lender on my behalf, and I want to tell you honestly that even with documentation as clean as mine, the process wasn't instantaneous or painless. The lender's fraud team initially requested additional verification, a formal statement from the certified handwriting examiner, a notarized affidavit from me confirming I had never applied for or knowingly authorized the loan, and at one uncomfortable juncture, a request that Ryan himself provide a written statement regarding how the signature had come to appear on the document. He provided it, without argument, in early January, a document in which he acknowledged in writing that he had signed my name himself without my knowledge or authorization. I remember reading that statement after Angela forwarded it to me and feeling something complicated, not vindication exactly, but a kind of quiet, sad relief that he hadn't tried, even at that late stage, to minimize or reframe what he'd actually done. Ryan and I are still married, as of the recording of this video, Though I want to be honest that still married does not mean unchanged. We began seeing Dr. Fairweather together in January, and those sessions have been some of the hardest, most necessary hours of our marriage. Not because Ryan is unwilling to face what he did, but because facing it has required him to examine a lifetime of conditioning around Courtney that he had never once in 39 years been asked to look at directly. There have been sessions where he's made real, visible progress. One, in March, where he finally said out loud, unprompted, that he thought his mother's phrase, "Courtney just feels things more than the rest of us," had functioned for 30 years as a permission slip for the whole family to treat fairness as optional whenever Courtney was involved. There have also been sessions where old patterns reassert themselves so completely it's hard to believe any progress happened at all. One, in April, where a routine discussion about splitting a small family expense turned, within minutes, into Ryan defending a text from Courtney asking to borrow money again, as though 18 months of therapy and a forged HELOC had changed nothing about the underlying reflex. I don't know yet, honestly, how this ends for us long term, and I think it would be dishonest of me to promise you a tidier resolution than the one I'm actually still living inside. Courtney and I have not spoken since that December dinner, beyond two brief logistical exchanges about the kids' holiday schedule. She has told Ryan, according to what he's shared with me, that she believes I used my job to make Ryan look like a criminal over what she still describes as a misunderstanding about paperwork. I don't know if she'll ever see it any other way, and I've had to make a kind of peace with that, the way you make peace with whether you can't control. What I do know is that the wellness studio, without the remaining capital Ryan can no longer provide, has stalled indefinitely. And this, too, is simply a consequence, not a punishment I engineered. The natural result of a business built on money that was never legitimately available in the first place. I also want to tell you about a conversation I had with my own sister, Jenna, in February, that captures something about how this rippled outward beyond just my marriage. Jenna told me she'd always assumed Ryan was simply the more agreeable one in our marriage, the easygoing counterweight to my more careful, detail-orientated nature, and that watching this unfold had genuinely reshaped how she saw him. Not as a villain, she was careful to say, but as someone whose agreeableness had a cost that had, for 15 years, quietly landed almost entirely on her. I hadn't realized, until she said it, how much of my own family had come to see our marriage the same simplified way Ryan's family saw Courtney's crises, as a fixed, harmless character trait rather than a pattern with a real and specific price attached. Diane and I have had, surprisingly, the most meaningful shift of anyone in this story. In February, she called me alone, without Ryan on the line, and told me she'd spent weeks turning over her own role in all of this. The phrase "Courtney just feels things more than the rest of us," and the estate plan she'd quietly redirected without ever considering how it looked from where I stood, 40 years of small accommodations that had, in her own words, built the exact conditions where something like this loan felt normal to my son. She hasn't fixed the estate plan, and I don't know if she will, but she said something to me on that call I didn't expect to hear from her ever. "Meredith, I think you've been the only adult in this family for a very long time, and none of us ever thanked you for it." I told her that wasn't really what I wanted. What I wanted, I told her, was simply to stop being the only one who noticed. I want to tell you about one more small moment before I close this out because it stayed with me since it happened. In March, my son Caleb, 7 years old, asked me, out of nowhere while we were building a Lego set together, why Daddy had been sleeping in the guest room. I told him, in language appropriate for a 7-year-old, that Mommy and Daddy were working through a hard problem together, the way people sometimes have to when they've made a mistake that hurt someone they love, and that working through it, even when it's slow and uncomfortable, is what people do when they actually want to keep loving each other honestly. He thought about that for a moment, snapped another Lego piece into place, and said, "So it's like when I have to fix something I broke instead of just saying sorry and doing it again." I told him that was exactly right, and that I hoped he'd remember that lesson a lot longer than some of the adults in his own life had managed to. I should tell you a little about my own family, too, because I think the contrast matters. I grew up as the older of 2 daughters, and my mother, Carol, and my father, before he passed in 2016, ran their household on a very different, though not perfect, philosophy, the idea that fairness between siblings mattered as much as love did, and that the two were never meant to substitute for each other. My sister Jenna and I fought plenty growing up, the way sisters do, But neither of us ever had to learn the specific lesson Ryan learned at 11 years old, that being loved and being useful were the same thing, and that the way you earned your place in the family was by absorbing whatever the other sibling couldn't handle. I didn't marry into a family that lacked love. I married into one that had simply never learned how to distribute its attention and its accountability along the same lines. And it took me the better part of 15 years to understand that this distinction, not cruelty, but imbalance, was the actual thing I was fighting. For my own part, this whole experience changed something in how I show up in my own life going forward, beyond just the outcome with the loan itself. I started, that January, keeping a shared financial dashboard with Ryan, not the private ledger I'd kept alone for 14 years, but an actual joint tool, visible to both of us and updated in real time, specifically so that neither of us would ever again have to reconstruct the other's decisions after the fact. I also started saying no more often, in small, unglamorous ways, to requests that used to feel automatic, declining to be the one who always drives the extra 40 minutes, and declining to quietly absorb a cost just because raising it out loud felt like more trouble than it was worth. None of that makes for a dramatic part of the story. But it's been honestly one of the most important changes to come out of all of this. Understanding that being capable and reliable never should have meant being endlessly, silently available to make everyone else's decisions safe to make without me. Now 11, who overheard enough of the fallout that spring to ask me directly, one evening while we were doing dishes together, why Aunt Courtney and I weren't talking anymore. I told her, in language appropriate for an 11-year-old, that sometimes people in a family make choices that hurt other people without meaning to become the villain of the story, and that it's okay to still love someone while also refusing to pretend what they did was fine. She was quiet for a moment, drying a plate, and then said, "So being nice and being honest aren't always the same thing?" I told her that was exactly right and that learning to tell the difference was probably one of the most important things I could ever teach her. I didn't plan that conversation. I think about it often. Patricia Voss passed away in the fall of 2025, just weeks before I found the HELOC flag on my dashboard, and I think about the timing of that often. One of the last real conversations we had that September, she asked me, almost offhand, whether I still kept my private ledger. I told her I did, though I hadn't added much to it in over a year, given how much calmer things had felt in our marriage by then. She smiled and said, "Good. Keep it anyway, you never know when the math is going to matter." I told her at the time that I hoped it never would again. 2 months later, sitting at my own desk with a fraud flag bearing my own name on the screen in front of me, I understood exactly what she'd meant, and I found myself wishing, more than almost anything else in those first difficult weeks, that I could call her and tell her she'd been right. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this, and I want to say it exactly the way I first understood it, sitting in my car in that parking garage back in November. The people who quietly keep the record, who stay calm when everyone around them gets loud, and who document instead of shout, we are so often mistaken for the least powerful person in the room. We are usually the opposite. Being the one who could always be counted on to hold things together was never a flaw in me. In the end, it was the only reason the truth in my marriage ever had a chance to survive contact with the people who needed, badly, not to hear it. I want to leave you with one more thought before I go, because I think it matters beyond just my own story. If you are the person in your family who keeps the record, the one who remembers the dates, the amounts, the promises that were never quite kept, I want you to hear this clearly. That instinct is not paranoia, and it is not pettiness, no matter how many times someone in your life has told you it is. It is, very often, the only thing standing between your family's comfortable version of events and what actually happened. You do not owe anyone a version of yourself that stops noticing simply because noticing makes other people uncomfortable. The math was never the problem. The problem was always that, for far too long, nobody else in the room was willing to do it alongside you. If this story meant something to you, comment with the word "overlooked" below and tell me whether you've ever had to be the one who kept the record in your own family. Share this with someone who spent their whole life being the reliable one. They'll know exactly what I mean without you having to explain a single part of it. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because there's another story coming soon, and I have a feeling, given everything you've just sat through with me, that you're going to want to hear it.